Mia had always been the kind of girl who went unnoticed. You know the type I'm talking about. Quietly tucked away in the corner of the classroom, her notebook flawless, yet surrounded by few, if any, friends. It was hard to tell if it was by choice or if people simply didn't realise she was there. That's just how she was, discreet, almost like a shadow, but not in a sad way. It was as if she preferred it that way, finding comfort in her anonymity. If there was one thing Mia truly loved, it was math. While most of the other students groaned at equations and anxiously counted the minutes until recess, Mia saw numbers differently. To her, solving problems was like uncovering mysteries. But even though she excelled at it, she made a point to keep her skills to herself. She avoided joining classroom discussions and never raised her hand, even when the answer was crystal, clear in her mind. Her daily routine was simple. She'd wake up early, eat breakfast quietly while her parents watched the news, and then walk to school. It was the kind of walk you take without rushing, taking in your surroundings but not letting anything distract you too much. She liked those moments, peaceful, free from noise, just her and her thoughts. At school, things weren't much different. Mia completed her assignments, always on time, and sat through classes without drawing any attention to herself. No one really noticed how brilliant she was with numbers, and honestly, that's how she wanted it. The fear of making a mistake in front of everyone, or worse, being labelled the class nerd, pushed her even further into the background. But here's the thing. Mia had talent. She wasn't just good at math. She had something extraordinary, a natural ability to spot patterns, solve complex problems, and find solutions no one else could see. The trouble was, she didn't see it as anything remarkable. To her, it was just normal. And so she stayed in the shadows. A quiet student, invisible to most, hiding a massive potential beneath the surface. The real question was, how long? Could Mia keep this talent hidden? And more importantly, what would happen when it finally came to light? Mrs. Taylor was the kind of teacher no one ever forgot, and it wasn't because she was a student favourite or because her classes were particularly inspiring. No, it was her strict, no-nonsense approach to everything. She had one clear rule: discipline above all else. Chaos, side conversations, or lack of effort. Not on her watch. From day one, students quickly learned that Mrs. Taylor had zero tolerance for laziness. If you've walked into this classroom, you've walked in to learn. And if you're not here to learn, the door is right there, she'd say, pointing to the exit with a ruler in her hand. It was a phrase she used so often that students started mocking her behind her back, whispering it to each other with giggles, but no one dared to do it in front of her. From the outside, Mrs. Taylor seemed perpetually angry. Any tardiness or wrong answer could easily spark a lecture. And it wasn't just the students who felt her wrath. If a fellow teacher stepped into her classroom without a solid reason, they'd get that icy glare that made people think twice before bothering her again. But what most people didn't know was that behind her tough exterior lay frustration. Mrs. Taylor loved teaching. She genuinely believed that education had the power to change lives. But she was tired of unmotivated students, indifferent parents, and a system that cared more about statistics than real learning. For her, the lack of enthusiasm from her students felt like a personal challenge. It was that frustration that drove her strictness. She believed that if she pushed hard enough, her students would eventually understand the value of hard work. But that didn't always work out. In reality, it created a tense atmosphere where most students just tried to get through her classes, unnoticed. A few occasionally attempted to push her buttons, but they quickly realised she wasn't one to mess with. Over time, Mrs. Taylor's patience grew thinner. It felt like she was constantly fighting to prove that her methods worked. But at that moment, it seemed no one was convinced, not the students and not even herself. She just wouldn't admit it. And it was in this strict, high-pressure environment that Mrs. Taylor's path crossed with Mia's. A collision between the rigid rules of a teacher and the hidden brilliance of a student who preferred to remain invisible. The question lingering in the air was, who would yield first? The math class was shaping up to be just another one of those, tense, filled with tired glances, and Mrs. Taylor's impatient tone echoing through the room. But that day, something shifted. The teacher, already irritated by the students' lack of responses, slammed the book onto the desk. "Is there anyone in this room who can solve this, or am I just talking to the walls?" She wrote a problem on the board, something complicated enough to make even the brightest students hesitate. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one dared to raise their hand. Some pretended to study their notebooks. Others stared out the window, wishing for time to move faster. Mia, as usual, kept her eyes fixed on the desk, hoping the moment would pass unnoticed. But Mrs. Taylor wasn't in the mood for patience that day. "Mia!" Her voice sliced through the silence like a knife. "You're over there, as quiet as ever. Let's see if you're even paying attention in class." Mia's heart raced. She could feel all eyes on her. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "You don't know because you don't want to know." The teacher shot back, mixing frustration with sarcasm. "Get up and solve the problem, now." Mia hesitated, but Mrs. Taylor didn't leave room for refusal. Her face burned with embarrassment, and she could feel her hands trembling as she walked to the board. It felt like all the air had vanished from the room. "Come on, we're waiting," the teacher said impatiently, folding her arms. Mia took the chalk with trembling fingers and stared at the problem. The board seemed bigger, the numbers and letters more intimidating. She took a deep breath and began writing, her mind struggling to focus. Every second felt like an eternity, and the muffled laughter from her classmates only added to the pressure. "That's wrong," Mrs. Taylor commented, interrupting before Mia could finish. "Are you even reading the problem properly? Is this how you plan to pass?" The comment hit Mia like a punch in the stomach, but she didn't give up. Without a word, she erased the line she'd written and tried again, this time slower, reviewing each step. Gradually, the logic began to click. Math was like a refuge, and despite the tension surrounding her, she knew she could trust her mind to find the way. When she finished, she placed the chalk back in its holder and stepped back, her gaze still, fixed on the board. The room was so quiet that she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Taylor walked up, inspecting what Mia had done. For a moment the teacher said nothing, and the silence grew unbearable. Then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Taylor let out a small sigh and crossed her arms again. "It's correct." The surprise in the teacher's voice was obvious. Some students exchanged shocked glances. The shy girl, who barely ever spoke, had solved one of the most difficult problems of the lesson. "But it took too long," Mrs. Taylor added quickly, as if trying to downplay the impact. "If you paid more attention, maybe it wouldn't have been so hard." Mia returned to her seat, saying nothing. On the outside, she looked embarrassed, but inside, she felt something different. Pride. Maybe. Relief. Definitely. As the lesson continued, Mrs. Taylor couldn't help but glance at Mia. From time to time, as if trying to figure out who this girl was, who, against all expectations, had surprised her. The silence in the room after the teacher's response felt thicker than anyone could imagine. No one dared to speak. Mia slowly made her way back to her seat, her eyes still fixed on the board, trying to process what had just happened. She knew that Mrs. Taylor, even though she'd admitted the answer was correct, didn't seem impressed, or at least not in the way Mia had expected. The teacher stood by the board, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Mia's solution again and shook her head, as though trying to make sense of what had just occurred. But before another word could be spoken, Mrs. Taylor spoke, her voice a little softer but still firm. "You knew you were right all along, didn't you?" Mia hesitated, her throat tight, the words slipping out with difficulty. I wasn't sure," she replied, almost in a whisper, her gaze lowered. "Don't play modest," the teacher retorted, her tone gentler than usual, but still cutting. "You were just afraid of being wrong. But you did it. Whether or not you had confidence. What matters is that you did what seemed impossible." Mrs. Taylor's eyes swept over the board, as if considering something more. The students, who had been completely silent until then, began to stir. Someone whispered, "She got it right." Others murmured among themselves, visibly impressed. Mia could feel every gaze on her, as though all of a sudden the weight of the world was on her shoulders. I didn't expect it to be like this," Mia muttered, feeling a mix of confusion and shame. She didn't want to be the centre of attention, but there she was, in the middle of something she never imagined. Mrs. Taylor turned to the class, momentarily ignoring Mia's discomfort. "Everyone's staring because they don't expect this. From a student like her," she said, vaguely gesturing to Mia. "But that's what happens when we underestimate others. She has more than just intelligence. She has potential, but it takes courage to use it. And that, my dear students, is something many of you need to learn." The teacher paused, and Mia felt her heart race. "I made a mistake. And Mia, you've shown me that I was wrong," Mrs. Taylor continued, her gaze softer now. "You have more than you realise, and from now on, I expect more from you." Mia didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to shrink away and disappear. Another part of her wanted to shout, perhaps out of frustration, or something she couldn't quite understand. It was a new feeling, one she never imagined she would experience. Mrs. Taylor finally stepped away from the board and returned to her desk, but her eyes remained fixed on Mia. It was as if the teacher was seeing something beyond the shy girl she had always noticed in class. Something was beginning to reveal itself, and even Mrs. Taylor didn't know where it would lead. The rest of the lesson went on, but the tension in the room was never the same. Some students still looked at Mia as if she were an enigma, something hard to comprehend. Others, more daring, began to ask questions about the problem, as if suddenly their admiration for the quiet girl had become something tangible. As Mia sat back in her seat, one thought lingered in her mind. Maybe it was time to start believing in what the teacher had said. Maybe she did have something to offer, something more than she herself knew. After that day, something was definitely different. Mrs. Taylor's classroom no longer felt like the heavy and intimidating place it once had. Mia felt a strange lightness when she entered the room, as if, in some way, she had carved out a small space for herself there. But it wasn't just that. She was beginning to realise that maybe the image she had of herself needed to be reconsidered. In the following days, Mrs. Taylor approached Mia more often than she could have imagined. Sometimes it was a word of encouragement, other times just a simple question about the lesson. But there was a clear change in her behaviour. She seemed to be making a conscious effort to involve Mia. The teacher no longer treated her like an invisible student. To Mia this meant something, though she still couldn't understand what exactly. Then, in what seemed like a normal moment, Mrs. Taylor did something that completely caught her off guard. She called her over for a conversation after class once. All the other students had left. "Mia, we need to talk," the teacher said, her expression serious, but without the critical tone she had used before. "You've been doing really well in the last few lessons. I think you have more potential than you're showing. Have you ever thought about competing in an academic competition?" Mia stared at the teacher, confused. Competing? She had never imagined participating in something like that. The idea seemed absurd, far from her reality as the quiet student who never stood out. I don't think I'm good enough to compete," she said, her voice trembling, trying to hide her nervousness. "You're more than good enough, Mia," Mrs. Taylor insisted. "I know you're scared. Everyone is. But you have what it takes. And these competitions are a chance to show what you can really do without needing to hide." Those words hit deeper than Mia would like to admit. Without needing to hide. It was as if the teacher had read her thoughts, as if she knew exactly how Mia felt. But Mia didn't know what to do with that. Participating in a competition meant exposing herself, putting her abilities under the gaze of others, something she never wanted. She preferred to stay in the background, quiet in the back of the room, avoiding attention. I'll think about it," Mia said, a small smile on her face, trying to hide the restlessness she felt inside. She didn't know if she was ready to take that step, but at the same time, something inside her started to question why she wasn't. Why had she always hidden? In the following days, Mia couldn't stop thinking about what the teacher had said. She could barely concentrate on the lessons because her mind was consumed with the idea of participating in a competition. The fear was still there, strong and present, but it began to feel like an obstacle she could maybe overcome. Mrs. Taylor, on the other hand, seemed to be paying more attention to every little detail. During class, she gave Mia a more intense look, as if waiting for something. At times, the teacher even seemed to be helping Mia prepare without saying much, just with subtle gestures. As if she were guiding the student, not in a rush, but in a way that made Mia understand that she believed in her. Finally, at the end of a class, Mia approached the teacher's desk again. Her breath was quick, but she managed to speak, her voice firmer than she expected. "I want to try. I want to participate." Mrs. Taylor smiled, her eyes sparkling with a light that Mia couldn't ignore. "Great. Let's do this together." From that moment on, something inside Mia seemed to have changed irreversibly. She didn't know exactly where that decision would take her, but one thing was certain. She was beginning to believe she had, in fact, something to offer. Something she hadn't even known she possessed. And the teacher, who had once treated her with indifference, was now becoming her greatest ally, ready to guide her beyond her limitations. Mia was finally beginning to take the first steps toward a future where, contrary to what she had always thought, she would be seen. And though it was terrifying, it no longer seemed impossible. Time had passed quickly since the day Mia made the decision to face her fears and sign up for the competition. She began dedicating more time to her studies, not only because she now knew she had a real chance, but because for the first time, she felt that her effort would be recognized. Mrs. Taylor's classroom, once a place of discomfort and fear, was now the stage where Mia could show her strength. Mrs. Taylor, in turn, had also changed. She was no longer the strict, distant teacher who instilled fear. The way she treated her students had transformed. She became more patient, more willing to understand the struggles of others and to help, just as she had done with Mia. The teacher spent more time talking to students individually, listening to their stories and trying to see what was behind the masks they all wore. She realized that just like Mia, many students carried something valuable within them that they couldn't express. When the competition came, Mia was nervous, but something inside her kept her steady. She sat in front of the panel of judges, feeling the pressure of being watched by everyone, but instead of hiding, she remembered the teacher's words. "You have what it takes." With that, she was able to focus. Her answer was clear, objective, and most importantly, authentic. She wasn't trying to please anyone, she was simply doing the best she could. At the end of the competition, Mia didn't take first place, but something inside her had changed. She realized she was no longer the shy girl who ran from challenges. She had faced her fears and come out stronger than ever. After the event, Mrs. Taylor pulled Mia aside. "I'm so proud of you, Mia. Not for the place you finished, but for the courage to expose yourself to show who you really are." Mia smiled, feeling warmth in her chest. She had never imagined that one simple teacher could do so much for her. And as she looked at Mrs. Taylor, Mia understood something important. It wasn't just her who had changed. The teacher had also learned perhaps more than anyone. Sometimes people aren't just what they appear to be at first glance. Everyone has something to offer, and it's important to give them a chance for that to be revealed. As she left school that day, with a shy smile on her face, Mia knew her future would be different. She no longer feared showing who she was, and, more importantly, she knew she could go beyond. The true lesson wasn't in the competition or in the grades, but in the process of allowing herself to grow and believe that, in the end, the greatest challenge is believing in herself. And so, Mia's story, a girl who once hid in the shadows, became a simple yet powerful reminder that talent should not be buried. And that true change begins when we stop hiding and start believing in our own worth.